The night was suffocating dark, the kind that seemed to swallow all light and sound. Lucas drove through the labyrinthine streets of the city, his eyes scanning the deserted sidewalks for potential fares. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of a woman at the corner of a shadowy intersection. She stood under a flickering streetlight, her white dress stained with dark, crimson patches. Lucas hesitated, but eventually pulled over, the taxi's brakes screeching in protest. The woman opened the door and slid into the back seat, her movements graceful yet unnerving. "Where to?" Lucas asked, his voice gruff. "Just drive," she replied, her tone cold and emotionless. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine but complied, the engine growling as the taxi moved forward. The city's desolation seemed to deepen with every turn, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. Mariana's reflection in the rearview mirror held Lucas's gaze. Her green eyes were pools of darkness, filled with an unfathomable sorrow and something more sinister. "Do you believe in ghosts, Lucas?" she asked suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. Lucas's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Not really," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "You should," she said softly. "They believe in you." As the taxi ventured deeper into the city's abandoned district, Lucas's unease grew. The streets seemed unfamiliar, twisted, and wrong. The radio, usually a source of background noise, crackled to life with a burst of static. Through the distortion, a voice began to emerge, chanting in a language Lucas couldn't recognize. He quickly turned the radio off, but the unsettling atmosphere remained. The woman leaned forward, her breath cold against his neck. "Do you know what it's like to be betrayed, Lucas? To be left to die alone?" Lucas's heart pounded. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, and for a moment, he saw not just Mariana but the reflection of a broken, bloodied figure looming behind her. His blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "I'm someone who has been waiting for a long time," she replied, her voice a chilling echo. Suddenly, the taxi's engine sputtered and died. They had arrived at an old, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of the city. The mansion's windows were dark, its walls covered in ivy and the signs of decay. The woman opened the door and stepped out, her movements eerily fluid. "Come with me," she beckoned, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Against his better judgment, Lucas followed her, drawn by an invisible force. The mansion's front door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced individuals. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. As they walked deeper into the mansion, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Lucas's footsteps echoed hollowly, each step feeling like a march towards his doom. Mariana led him to a grand hall, its floor stained with old, dried blood. In the center of the hall stood a large, ancient mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with something dark and viscous. "Look into the mirror, Lucas," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody. Reluctantly, he stepped forward and gazed into the mirror. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Reflected at him was not just his own image, but a scene of unimaginable horror. A group of people, their faces twisted in agony, reached out to him, their hands bloody and torn. Among them, he recognized the faces of those he had loved and lost. Suddenly, the figures in the mirror began to move, their screams piercing the silence. Lucas stumbled back, his mind reeling. Mariana stood beside him, her eyes now black voids. "You cannot escape your past," she said, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness of the hall. "And you cannot escape me." As the shadows in the hall seemed to come alive, closing in on Lucas, he realized with dawning horror that this was not just a nightmare. This was his reality, and there was no waking up. Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the mirror, the haunting images searing into his mind. The grand hall around him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the walls breathing in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Shadows twisted and coiled like living serpents, and the temperature plummeted, the chill biting into his flesh. "Why are you doing this?" Lucas demanded, his voice trembling. Mariana's expression remained inscrutable. "Because you need to remember, Lucas. You need to face what you've done. What I've done. Lucas's voice cracked with a mix of confusion and fear. I don't understand. Mariana's eyes bore into his soul. You will. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and Lucas found himself drawn into its depths. The world around him dissolved into a blur of colors and sounds, and he was thrust into a nightmarish vision. Lucas stood in the middle of a dark, rain-soaked street. He recognized it instantly, the intersection where he had first picked up Mariana. But now, it was populated with ghostly figures, their faces obscured by shadows. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the sound of distant, echoing cries. He watched in horror as a younger version of himself stumbled into view, drenched and frantic. The younger Lucas clutched a blood-stained knife, his eyes wide with panic. Behind him, the body of a woman lay crumpled on the pavement, her life slowly ebbing away. No, Lucas whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. This can't be real. But the vision continued relentlessly. The younger Lucas fled the scene, disappearing into the night, leaving the woman to die alone. Her eyes, filled with pain and betrayal, locked onto the spot where Lucas stood, and he felt the weight of her gaze pierce his very soul. The vision shattered, and Lucas was thrust back into the grand hall. He collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with the aftershock of the horrific memory. Mariana stood over him, her expression one of cold satisfaction. You left her to die, she said, her voice a chilling whisper. And now, you must pay the price. Lucas's mind reeled as the memory resurfaced with brutal clarity. He had tried to bury it, to forget the night he had taken a life in a fit of rage and fear. But now, the past had come back to haunt him with a vengeance. I didn't mean to, he stammered, tears streaming down his face. It was an accident. I panicked. Mariana knelt beside him, her hand gently caressing his cheek. Accidents have consequences, Lucas, and some sins can never be forgiven. The shadows in the hall began to close in, their forms solidifying into grotesque, twisted figures. They reached out with clawed hands, their voices a cacophony of anguish and rage. Lucas scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you want from me? Mariana's eyes gleamed with a sinister light. I want you to suffer as she suffered, to feel the pain and terror she felt in her final moments. The ghostly figures advanced, their presence overwhelming. Lucas backed away, his mind racing. Desperation clawed at his sanity as he searched for a way out. The mansion seemed to shift and contort, the walls closing in like the jaws of a great beast. In a last-ditch effort, Lucas bolted towards the nearest door, flinging it open with all his strength. He stumbled into a long, narrow corridor, the walls lined with more portraits of the damned. Their eyes followed him, their expressions a blend of sorrow and accusation. He ran, his footsteps echoing through the endless passage. The corridor twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. Lucas's lungs burned, and his legs ached, but he pushed on, driven by sheer terror. Finally, he burst into a small room at the end of the corridor. It was sparsely furnished, with a single chair facing a window that looked out into an impenetrable black void. Lucas collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. As he lay there, gasping for breath, the door slowly creaked open. Mariana stepped inside, her presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. There is no escape, Lucas, she said softly. You can run, but you cannot hide from your past. Lucas looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. What do you want me to do? Mariana smiled, a cold, haunting expression. Face the truth. Accept your guilt. Only then can you find redemption. Lucas's mind raced as he tried to comprehend her words. The truth. The guilt. He had spent years burying the memory, but now it had resurfaced with a vengeance. He realized that the only way to end this nightmare was to confront his past head-on. Taking a deep breath, Lucas stood up and faced Mariana. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. Mariana's eyes softened, and for a moment, Lucas saw a flicker of humanity in her gaze. Then let's begin. As the room darkened and the walls seemed to close in, Lucas braced himself for the final confrontation. The shadows gathered around him, their whispers growing louder, and he knew that this was only the beginning. Lucas's resolve was tested as the shadows thickened, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. The room around him faded, replaced by an oppressive void where time and space seemed to blur. He stood face to face with Mariana, her presence both a beacon and a torment. To truly face the truth, Mariana intoned, her voice echoing through the void, "You must relive that night, not as the man who fled, but as the woman who suffered." Before Lucas could react, the void collapsed, plunging him into a vivid, horrifying replay of that fateful night. He was no longer in control of his body. He was seeing the world through the eyes of the woman he had left to die. It was raining heavily, each drop feeling like a knife against her skin. The woman, Mariana, was walking down the deserted street, her mind racing with fear. She had just escaped a violent encounter with Lucas, his rage fueled by jealousy and misunderstanding. Lucas, now inhabiting Mariana's perspective, felt every ounce of her fear and pain. He felt the sting of the knife as it sliced through her flesh, the cold seep into her bones as she lay bleeding on the pavement. The realization of her impending death, her thoughts of loved ones she would never see again, all of it crashed over him like a tidal wave. No, stop, Lucas's mind screamed, but he was powerless to change the course of events. He was forced to watch, to feel, as Mariana's life slipped away, alone and in agony. The vision shattered, and Lucas was thrust back into the dark room, gasping for breath. His body was soaked in sweat, his mind reeling from the intensity of the experience. Mariana stood before him, her expression one of sorrow and understanding. "Now you know," she said softly. "Now you understand the pain you caused." Lucas sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I was a coward. I should have helped you. I should have faced the consequences." Mariana knelt beside him, her cold hand resting on his shoulder. "Regret is a powerful force, Lucas. It can either consume you or set you free." Lucas looked up at her, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "What do I need to do?" Mariana's form began to shimmer, her edges blurring into the surrounding darkness. "You must make amends. Help those who suffer as I did. Use your life to bring light into the darkness." As she spoke, the shadows around them began to recede, the oppressive weight lifting from Lucas's shoulders. The room transformed into the grand hall once more, but now it was bathed in a soft, ethereal light. "Your journey is just beginning," Mariana said, her voice fading as her form became more translucent. "Remember what you've learned here. Let it guide you." With that, Mariana dissolved into the light, leaving Lucas alone in the grand hall. The portraits on the walls now seemed less accusatory, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Lucas stood, his body and mind exhausted but his spirit renewed. He knew his path would not be easy, but he was determined to make amends for his past. As he stepped out of the mansion and into the dawn's early light, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The city streets, once dark and foreboding, now seemed filled with potential. Lucas climbed back into his taxi, his mind clear and his heart resolute. He would spend the rest of his life helping those in need, seeking redemption one good deed at a time. And though the memory of that night would always haunt him, it would also serve as a reminder of the second chance he had been given. As he drove off into the city, the sun rising behind him, Lucas knew that he was no longer running from his past but embracing his future.